Hi class, today we're going to talk about activity-based costing, and we're going to do a couple of exercises with that. I'm sharing with you exercise 4.5, which has to do with activity-based costing, and we're going to be using products for a particular company that's producing weed eaters. The types of weed eaters that we're producing is a basic weed eater and an advanced weed eater. And when we're talking about activity-based costing, what we want to do is we want to assign the overhead to the company's activities. This company has 4 activities. They are machining, engineering, receiving, and inspection. Information about these activities and their drivers are given below. And so they gave us a table and they told us exactly how many units that were produced of the basic weed eaters and the advanced weed eaters. They've talked about prime costs. Now, to review on what prime costs are, those are your direct materials and your direct labor. They went ahead and combined that together. For the basic weed eater, the direct materials and direct labor, or the prime cost, were $8 million. For the advanced weed eater, it was $30 million. They've given us machine hours for the basic weed eater, which is 100,000. For the advanced weed eaters, 500,000. And they've also given us the total machine hours out to the side here. Engineering hours were given to you for both the basic weed eater and the advanced weed eater, and combined together, the total engineering hours is 4,000. Receiving orders was 400 for the basic weed eater, 1,200 for the advanced weed eater, and then 1,600 for the total. Inspection hours were 800 for the basic weed eater, 1,600 for the advanced weed eater, and 2,400 as a total inspection hours. All this information is given to you. Now, the costs that you're going to be looking at that are a part of factory overhead are your machining cost, your engineering cost, your receiving cost, and your inspecting products cost. All of these are overhead accounts, and what we're going to be doing is assigning them to the activities based on the hours of that particular activity that you're working on. So all of this here is given information. Under the requirements, we want to calculate the 4 activity rates. The activities are going to be machining, engineering, receiving, and inspecting products. Those are our types of activities that we're going to be looking at. So those are the 4 activities that we're going to calculate an activity rate for. Starting with machining, we're going to take the total machining overhead cost, which were $6 million for this company, and we're going to divide this $6 million by the total machine hours that was given. The total machine hours is 600,000. So this $6 million is going to be divided by 600,000 machine hours, and that will give us an activity rate of $10 per hour. You're going to do basically the same thing for each type of overhead cost or each activity. Engineering, the total engineering costs were $2 million. We're going to divide that by the engineering hours of 4,000. Remember, we're getting the total hours. So let me back it up here so you can see this table really good here. The total hours for the engineering hours is 4,000, and that's what we're using. All they want is the activity rate for each activity. So we're using total hours to divide that by. For the receiving activity, it's $560,000 is the total cost of the receiving, but we're going to divide that by the receiving orders. The receiving orders was given, and that total amount of the receiving orders was 1,600. So 560,000 divided by 1,600 would give you $350 as the activity rate. The inspecting activity rate is based on 360,000 total inspecting overhead cost divided by the total inspecting hours. The total inspecting hours is 2,400, and that's going to give you $150 as the activity rate. So the activity rate for each one of these different types of activities is the rate of the activity, or in other words, this $10 would be per hour for machine hours, 500 per hour for total engineering hours, 350 per hour for total receiving reports, and so on and so forth. In part 2, they want you to calculate the unit cost using the activity rates, and they want you to round your answers to the nearest cent. Again, they're asking us here for the unit cost of each one of our products. So what I did is I set up a table for showing both of my products, the basic weed eater and the advanced weed eater. And I also showed each activity that would go into producing these products. So for the basic weed eater, I had to come up with the machining cost based on this activity rate, which was $10. I'm going to scroll up to our table with our information on it. We're talking about machine hours, and the basic weed eater took 100,000 machine hours. So 100,000 times $10 is how we're getting the $1 million in machining costs that are associated with the product basic weed eater. So each one of these activities is going to show up in the weed eater products. So we've got to figure out the number of hours that the basic weed eater was using and multiply it by the activity rate. So for machining, for engineering, here, we're going to pick up the activity rate for engineering, which was $500, and we're going to multiply that by the basic weed eater engineering hours, which was 400 hours. So 500 times 400 is how we're getting the total cost of the engineering for the basic weed eater. So once again, all I'm doing is I'm taking each one of these activities and multiplying it by the hours for each activity based on the product. So we're only looking at the basic weed eater hours here, which is coming from this column right here. Machine hours was this. This times the machine hour activity rate will give you the total machining for the basic weed eater. Engineering hours times the activity rate will give you the cost of engineering for the basic weed eaters, and the receiving orders times the activity for receiving orders will give you the total receiving order cost that would be applied to the basic weed eater. And inspection hours, the number of inspection hours times the inspecting activity rate would give you the cost of the inspecting. So the total cost of the basic weed eater is $1 million plus 200,000 plus 140,000 plus 120,000. All those added together All of these costs right here added together will give you that sum of the total overhead cost. Now, you have to find the overhead cost first for each product. Then you would take the overhead cost and divide it by the number of units that were produced of the basic weed eater, and that would give you the cost for the overhead cost. That would just give you the overhead cost, which they're going to ask you for in the next part. But right now, just calculating the total overhead cost, all we're doing is we're applying each activity that we used, the activity rates times the hours in each one of these activities will give you the total overhead cost. Now, before we could calculate the unit cost of the basic weed eater, we would need to know the total cost of the weed eater. So the prime cost they gave to us, remember, were $8 million. These prime costs consist of your direct materials and your direct labor. We just figured up our overhead costs, so the combination of both of these will give you the total product cost of $9,460,000. So again, that $9,460,000 was your prime cost, which are your direct materials and your direct labor, plus your overhead. These are really the total manufacturing cost. And we would divide that by the number of basic weed eaters that we produced. And that number of basic weed eaters that we produced is right here given in this table. So 100,000 is divided into 9,460,000, and that will give you what they wanted this answer to be, the cost per unit. They're asking you to calculate the cost per unit for this basic weed eater. So the manufacturing cost again are direct materials and direct labor, which they combine together with prime cost, plus your total overhead cost. Your total manufacturing cost or your total cost of the product is $9,460,000. That divided by the number of weed eaters, basic weed eaters that were produced will give you the cost per unit. For the advanced weed eater, we're doing the same thing, except we're going to use the number of hours for the advanced weed eater. So in machining, it took 500,000 hours. We would multiply that by the activity rate of $10, which would give you $5 million of overhead that was devoted to the machining for the advanced weed eater. So this 1,800,000 for engineering is found by taking the activity rate for engineering, which was 500, and multiplying it by the advanced weed eaters engineering hours, which was 3,600. And so that's how they come up with the total cost of engineering for the advanced weed eater at 1,800,000. For receiving, we're doing the same thing. We're taking the activity rate and we're multiplying it by cell address E11, which was the receiving orders. And that will give you the 420,000. For inspecting, they're doing the same thing. They're taking the activity rate of 150 and multiplying it by the number of inspecting hours for the advanced weed eater, which was 1,600. Combine all of your activities together to get the total overhead cost. Your total overhead cost for your advanced weed eater is $7,460,000. The problem again is asking you for the total unit cost. This is just for the overhead portion of the cost. we have to add the overhead cost and the prime cost together, which was your direct materials and your direct labor, to get your total cost of the product. The total cost of the advanced weed eaters was $37,460,000. We would divide that by the number of advanced weed eaters that we produced, which was given up above at 300,000, and that will leave us with the cost per unit of $124.87. Now, in the second part of requirement 2, they have you calculating the total overhead cost per unit. Well, we had to find the total overhead first, and then what you would do is divide that total overhead by the number of basic weed eaters that are produced. That'll give you this $14.60. So the total overhead cost is here. Divide this by the number of weed eaters produced, which was 100,000, and that will give you the overhead cost per unit for the basic weed eater. For the advanced weed eater, we do the same thing. We pick up the overhead cost for the advanced weed eater. We would divide it by the number of advanced weed eaters that we produced, which was 300,000. And that will give you the $24.87. So this is the overhead cost per unit, which is a part of these costs over here. This is the total cost per unit. So this total cost per unit is really your materials per unit, your labor per unit, and your factory overhead per unit. Now in the third part, it says if consumption ratios are used instead of activity rates to assign the cost, show the cost for the inspection activity only. They only did one activity, so they would reduce the number of calculations that you had to do for this. What you need to know about the consumption ratio is that you're going to be determining the total consumption of just the inspecting activity. So I'm going to go back up to our original table here. And if we look at the inspecting activities, you can see that that overhead cost total was $360,000. The overhead cost total is going to be divided by the total inspection hours to get this consumption ratio. But now, again, they wanted you to do this based on the two products themselves. So we need to know the number of inspection hours, which comes from C12. And the inspection hours are right here for, remember, we're doing it just for inspection. The basic weed eater had 800 inspection hours. So we're going to take that 800 and we're going to divide it by the total inspection hours for both weed eaters. The total hours is 2,400. So 2,400 there might be another way to do this too. So they took, let's see, B42, which is the 800 hours, and they divided it by B44, which is the total hours. Yeah, it's 2,400. So there's two ways that you could look at that. You could get it from here, or I tried to make it a little bit easier so you could see where it came from as 2,400. So when you see consumption ratios, all they're talking about is a ratio where you're going to divide the number of hours by the total hours. In this case, we're only using the inspection activity. The basic weed eater, it took 800 inspection hours. The advanced weed eater was 1,600 inspection hours. The two of those combined is the total inspection hours. For the basic weed eater, we'd take 800 hours and divide it by 2,400, and that would give us 0.33333, or you could have used a fraction of 1/3 here if you wanted to. And 1/3 of the total cost of the inspection would be the cost for inspection for the basic weed eater. So this 1/3 amount here would be multiplied by 360,000 to get 120,000, which would be your cost assignment for the inspection if you were using consumption ratios. For the advanced weed eater, we would take the 1,600 hours and divide it by 2,400 hours, and that would give us 67%. And 67% is our consumption ratio that we would multiply by 360,000, and that would give us 240,000 rounded. That's the cost assignment for the advanced weed eater. The basic weed eater cost assignment for inspection plus the advanced weed eater's cost assignment for inspection will end up being the total amount of the inspection cost for that period of time. So you could double check it, seeing that 360,000 equals the 360,000 that they had given you earlier. Because there might be a rounding error with this. You could have just rounded this up to 1/3 and this to be 2/3 and used a fraction to get the exact hour. But it would be so close it wouldn't make any difference to me. But that's how you do it. So to come up with the basic ratio for the basic weed eater, we would take the basic weed eater inspection hours and divide them by the total inspection hours. That's how we're getting that consumption ratio. So I just restated it for you here in case you'd like to see it written out. I'd like to give you multiple ways to look at it. And so this problem was mainly devoted to activity-based costing. And we did it with activity rates, and we also did it based on consumption ratios. The next problem that I want to do for you or with you is exercise 4.6. And in this problem, again, we're using activity-based accounting, costing to apply overhead. And we're going to assign the cost of resources to activities. And they also call this unbundling the general ledger. This time we're going to be Golding Bank, and we have been provided the following data about its resources and activities for its checking account process. Now, class, they gave you the supervision all the way down to the total. They gave you the cost of the resources. They gave you the activities. I added in some extra information, hopefully that will help you to understand what they are wanting you to do here. Again, we are going to be applying our overhead to our activities. So we're going to be distributing the cost of these resources. This is our overhead right here that we've got here. The cost of each one of these resources, we're going to be distributing those based on what drives those costs. So for supervision, the cost of the resources was $70,000. And what I did, this was given information right here. this supervision, the cost of resources, the activities, and the clerical hours were given. I added some extra information to this because of the way they wanted you to look at these activities. And so what you have to do is you have to be really careful when you're reading these problems and try to look at the information that they've given you, and this will help you to understand how they're allocating their resources. The additional information that they gave you was that computers are only used by the issuing and processing transaction activities. So we have issuing statements. And they really should have said issuing statements here. Sometimes I wonder who's writing these problems in Cengage. But these are computers that are used only by the issuing of statements activity. And we're going to use those computers for 30% of the issuing statements activity. That's 30% of the time. And the rest of the time is going to be for processing transactions. So we use our computer for issuing statements and also for processing transactions. So if we are dividing the cost of the resources up for the computers, we would divide part of that toward issuing the statements at 30% of this 25,000. And the rest of it, of the 25,000, would go to processing transactions, this activity here. So the additional information is very important. Read it carefully. The phone and supplies, that's this right here, we spent $90,000 on it. But 60% of that 90,000 is for customer inquiries. So part of the activities for the phone and supplies were because of customer inquiries. That 60% went to customer inquiries of the phone and supplies cost. And the other 40% are going to be divided equally among the remaining activities. So we had other activities other than just the answering the customer inquiries. We had processing accounts, issuing statements, processing transactions, and we even had supervising clerks that would be a part of this dividing of that remaining 40%. So the remaining 40% of the phone and supplies amount is divided equally among the remaining activities, which includes the supervising activities. So there are 4 activities there that they're dividing that remainder by. The supervisor, it also says, spends 100% of his time on supervision. So we're going to know that all of the supervisor's salaries are going to go into 100% of the supervisor's cost or the resources. All of his time is spent in supervising. And it says, in addition to the 25,000 clerical hours, there are 2,000 hours of supervision used. Notice what they gave you to start with was just the processing account hours, the issuing statement hours, the processing transaction hours, and the customer inquiring hours, answering customer inquiries hours. But here they're telling you to include 2,000 of supervisor hours. That's why I added this little bit in here, so you know that this 2,000 hours should be added to the clerical hours to get the total hours. And this, just to further explain that, I stuck this in here to say that the total hours without supervising is 25,000. If we wanted to, which they did not ask us to do, but we could have assigned the cost based on the total hours. And if we had done that, we would have made a ratio out of each one of the costs that we would be working with. So for the supervisor's hours, they would have used 2,000 hours out of the total amount of 27,000 hours. That's how I'm coming up with this little percentage here. 10,000 hours divided by 27,000 hours gives you the percentage of hours that they could have chosen to use to allocate some of these costs. I threw this extra step in because they did that in an example in your textbook. And so I was trying to follow along with that example so you wouldn't get confused. But I don't think they used this at all in this particular problem, but you could have. So the main thing that you have to worry about is looking at the additional information and trying to decipher the way that they want you to split these overhead costs toward the activities. And so notice that I put my own little note here. I've got this highlighted for you. This was not a part of the problem, but I thought it might help explain what we were really doing in this problem here. I feel like the Cengage left off some stuff that they probably should have told you here. And this is what I think they should have told you in addition to this other stuff. You see here that there are salaries here. These are clerk salaries. But supervision also had some salaries associated with this 70,000, and they weren't real clear here, but this 70,000 is supervision salaries. And these are clerk salaries. So 275,000 of the salaries are split between the activities where they're using the percentage of time on each activity. That percentage of time on the activity is this percentage right here that they ask us to calculate in a matrix, which is just a table that would set up to show how the activities are using their time on each activity, or what the percentage of time is on each one of these activities. So the supervising activity, the supervisor, 100% of their salaries were included in the splitting of the supervision amount here. In other words, this 70,000 is most likely, most of this right here is salary. It's a salary for the supervisor. The supervisor salary is going to be 70,000 in this particular problem. And since the supervisor spends 100% of his time on supervision, all of that salary here is going to be included just for the supervisor. Now, they're telling you that the supervisor spends 100% of his time on supervision. But in addition to the 25,000 clerical hours, there are 2,000 of hours for supervision that is used. So when you're looking at the percentage of time on each activity, the supervisor would be supervising the clerk. And they're spending 100% of their time supervising the other clerks. And the supporting calculations would be 2,000 hours divided by the total hours, which is 2,000. So in other words, 100% of 2,000 hours is 2,000 divided by 2,000. There were 2,000 supervisor hours divided by the total supervisor's hours would mean that the supervisor spent 100% of their time supervising the other clerks. The clerks wouldn't get any of this, in other words. So 100% of the supervision amount would go to just the supervising clerks. The supervising of clerks goes to the supervisor, and that's the salary there. This 100% goes in at 70,000 when you're calculating the cost of each activity. Let me go back again to the percentage of time on each activity. So for supervising, there were 2,000 hours of supervision that were used, and those were the total hours. That means 100% of the time was spent in supervising. For processing accounts, which is an activity, we would take the total processing accounts hours, which was 10,000, came from the given information here, and we would divide that by 25,000 hours. And that will give us the processing percentage for the clerks. The amount of times that the clerk spent on processing accounts was 40% of the total hours. So 10,000 hours was spent in processing divided by the total activity hours gives you 40% for processing. For issuing statements, 5,000 hours was given. That came from the information from above. We're issuing statements. The hours, the clerical hours for issuing statements was 5,000. I'm going to take 5,000 and divide it by the total hours that do not have the supervision hours included with it, because it's just about the clerical hours here. The total clerical hours of 25,000. So 5,000 divided by 25,000 will give you a percentage for phone for issuing statements. So 5,000 divided by 25,000 gives you 20% of the time is spent preparing our financial statements or issuing the financial statements. For processing transactions, putting them in the journal, the ledger, preparing, getting ready, doing trial balance, things like that, getting ready to issue the statements, processing the transaction. It's going to take 7,000 hours that was given. There were 7,000 hours that were used for processing transactions. We would divide that by 25,000 hours, just the clerical hours. And that will give us 28% of our time is spent on processing transactions. For answering customer inquiries, is 3,000 hours. They told us that amount here, divided by 25,000 hours. That would give you the time that is spent on each activity, which is 12% for answering customer inquiries. So we have the percentage of time on each activity calculated. Then they wanted you to calculate the cost of each activity. So what I did is I thought it would be easier to show it to you in a table format. I took each one of the activities. Each one of the activities came from above. We had these 4 activities here, and then I just restated them here. These 4 activities were here. And the other activity would be to supervise the clerk. So I'm sorry, those were the resources I pointed to a minute ago. The activities are listed here. Supervising clerks, processing accounts, issuing statements, processing transactions, answering customer inquiries. These are all the activities. I just restated those here in this table like this. And then I took each one of the cost or the resources that we were using during this period of time. The overhead cost for the computer, I started with it first. And the reason I started with it first is because the additional information started with it first. So the computer cost total was $25,000. And because of the additional information, it said that 30% of this $25,000 is going to go to issuing statements. So 30% of $25,000 is the part of the cost of the computer that will go toward the issuing statements activity. They also told us that the remaining 70% of the activities were for processing transactions. The activity was processing transactions, so 70% of $25,000 is what I put down for processing transactions. And then I just retotaled it just to make sure that I had these two calculated right. This gives you a system of checks and balances. And so I have split my cost of the computer toward issuing statements and processing transactions based on what they have told me right here on line 16. The next thing they told us about was the phone and supplies. So I'm going to take the cost of the phone and supplies, which was $90,000. 60% of those are going to go toward customer inquiries. So 60% of $90,000 I put into customer inquiries. That's what goes here. The other 40% is divided equally among the remaining activities, which includes the supervising activities. So 40% of the $90,000 goes toward the remaining activities. We're going to divide the remaining portion, that 40% of the $90,000, we're going to divide it by 4 activities. 4 of the remaining activities. The remaining activities were supervising clerks, processing accounts, issuing statements, and processing transactions. So 40% of the 90,000 would be divided by the 4 remaining activities, which will give you 9,000 for each of the 4 remaining activities. And then I totaled it up just to make sure I had everything calculated right here. And that total should come back to 90,000 as a system of checks and balances. Then I went on to line 18. The supervisor spends 100% of his time on supervision. So 100% of the supervisor's salaries, which amounted to 70,000, are spent just in supervising. Notice nothing else went into the other types of activities. They could have split it to the other activities, but in this part, they did not. All right. And what they should have told you is that the remaining amounts, see, we've taken care of all of these now. This is only when we have remaining. This 275,000 are split between the activities by the percentage of time on each activity. That would kind of make sense. These are clerk salaries, so it could only be based on what the clerks were doing, the clerk's time. And the clerk's time were split by 40% for processing the accounts, 20% for issuing the statements, 28% for processing transactions, and 12% for answering customer inquiries. So of the remaining salaries, 0 went to supervising the clerks because the 275,000 is for the clerk's salaries, not the supervisor of the clerk. It's just the clerk's salaries. The clerk's salaries, this 275,000 is split 40% by processing the accounts. In other words, they spend 40% of their time processing accounts. Maybe they're looking at getting an invoice together, or maybe they're looking at the general ledger. It really doesn't tell us what they mean by processing accounts, but they can be doing all kinds of things for that. But 40% of the time, the 275,000 in total salaries is devoted to processing accounts. 20% of the time is in preparing statements. So 20% of 275,000 is going to give you 55,000. 28% of 275,000 will give you 77,000 for processing transactions. 12% for customer inquiries times 275,000 will give you 33,000 that went to customer inquiries. And again, I just totaled it just to make sure I had my numbers right. And then out to the side, this is what they're really asking you for when they're asking you to calculate the cost of each activity. Supervising clerks, the cost of supervising clerks is 79,000. It was the phone and supplies that the supervisor's using plus their salary gives you gives you 79,000. Processing accounts, phone and supplies were 9,000, salaries were 110,000. The total is 119,000. So the calculated cost of processing accounts is 119,000. Issuing statements, 71,500. You're just adding straight across here to get the cost of each one of these activities. Once you've got all the costs, add them together just to make sure that this comes up to the $460,000 total. That was the systems of checks and balances. Either way, across or straight down, it should give you $460,000. And that's the way you can check to make sure that you've done everything correct. Now on part 3 is a what if analysis. They say, what if the cost of the supervising activity is assigned to the other 4 activities? What is the final cost of these 4 primary activities? Well, basically, everything that we did before, I just copied down here, except for right here for supervision. Now we're going to split this supervision out, or actually we're splitting out the total cost of supervision by the time that is spent on each activity. So processing accounts is 40%. 40% of 79,000 gives you 31,600. That is for supervision. In other words, if you can think of it like this, in this what if analysis, they're absorbing the supervisor's salary into the other cost. So really all you're doing is dividing these supervisor salaries by the time that would be spent in each activity or on each activity. So 20% of 79,000 is going to give you 15,800. 28% of 79,000 will give you 22,120. So 12% of 79,000 would give you the remaining division of the supervisor's cost split between the other activities. Notice the salaries just stayed the same because the salaries were included for the supervisor over here. So then you just retotal your lines of straight across. And so processing accounts had phone and supplies, supervision, and salaries included in it to get the total here. For issuing statements, they also use the computer plus phone and supplies plus supervision plus their salaries. So you're just adding across, and then when you get through, add these down. It should equal up to 460,000 again as a check, and these straight across will also equal 460,000. So the thing about activity-based costing is you got to really concentrate on how they wanted you to divide your cost of your resources to, or to split those cost of resources to the activities. So it's all about reading your transactions as to how you come up with how they are dividing these costs. But this is activity-based costing, and all we're doing is we're assigning overhead to our activities. Notice in this problem, it was just assigning overhead to activities. In the previous problem that we did today, it was assigning the activities to the products. So that's all I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'll see you again the next time. Bye-bye.